The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the penthouse living room, and every head in the room turned toward Sienna Marlowe. "I'm so sorry," she said, already crouching to gather the shards, her cheeks burning under the chandelier light. The woman who had bumped into her, tall and silver-sequined, didn't even look down. She kept talking to the man beside her, as if Sienna were a piece of furniture that had briefly malfunctioned. "Careful!" someone murmured behind her, not to warn her, but to mock her. Wouldn't want her to break something more expensive than herself. A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd gathered near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Cross penthouse, 62 stories above Manhattan. Sienna kept her spine straight as she stood, holding the broken glass in a napkin, and reminded herself why she was here. Not to be liked, not to be seen, to work. She was the interior designer hired to transform this space, a job she had fought 3 other firms for, a job that would put her name in every glossy magazine in the city if she did it right. The problem was that Adrian Cross's world was not built for people like her, women whose bodies didn't fit the narrow mold this room called elegant. She had learned long ago to walk into rooms like this without apology. Learning to survive the stares never meant they stopped hurting. "Ms. Marlowe," the voice came from behind her, low, deliberate, cutting through the party noise like a blade through silk. She turned, and the room seemed to shift its attention entirely, as if gravity itself answered to this man. Adrian Cross stood half a head taller than everyone near him, dressed in black that had no interest in trends, only in precision. His eyes were the kind of gray that made people forget what they were about to say. He was not smiling. He rarely did, according to everyone she'd spoken to before tonight. "Mr. Cross." She held out her hand, steady, despite the way her pulse had picked up. "I was just finishing the walkthrough of the East Wing. I have some initial notes on." "You dropped a glass," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. His gaze moved over her, not the way the woman in sequins had looked through her, but the way an architect studies a building before deciding whether it's structurally sound. "Are you hurt?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked that tonight. Not even the assistant who'd handed her the guest badge with a look that said she didn't belong past the lobby. "No," she said. "Just embarrassed." "Don't be." He glanced past her shoulder, toward the woman in sequins, and something cold passed behind his eyes before it vanished. Embarrassment is a currency people spend on you when they want to see if you'll flinch. Before she could respond, a man in a gray suit appeared at Adrian's side and murmured something in his ear. Adrian's jaw tightened. Without another word to her, he turned and walked toward the private hallway at the back of the penthouse, his men falling into step behind him, like shadows detaching from a wall. Sienna exhaled and looked down at the napkin, still cradled in her hand, glass biting faintly into her palm through the fabric. She hadn't imagined her first night working for New York's most feared businessman would begin with public humiliation and a stranger's unreadable eyes. She didn't know yet that Adrian Cross was not, in any official sense, a businessman. She didn't know the 62nd floor held rooms that weren't on any blueprint, doors that led to men with guns instead of guest suites. She also didn't know the woman in silver sequins, the one who'd shattered her glass, and her composure, in the same careless gesture, was Vivian Hale, Adrian's former fiancée, a woman whose smile could still make grown men in this industry go quiet with fear. Sienna set the broken glass on a passing waiter's tray and made her way toward the East Wing again, determined to finish her notes and leave before anyone else could remind her she didn't belong. She was halfway down the hallway when she noticed the seam in the wall. It was subtle, a hairline gap in the paneling that didn't match the blueprints she'd been given. She crouched, running her fingers along the edge, and felt it give slightly, as if it wasn't wall at all, but a door built to look like one. Can I help you with something? She startled upright. One of Adrian's security men stood at the end of the hall, watching her with the flat expression of someone who had asked a question that was really a warning. Checking the wall alignment, she said evenly, for the renovation. The East Wing tour is over for tonight, Ms. Marlowe. She nodded and walked past him, his eyes on her back the entire way, her mind circling the hidden seam like a moth around something it wasn't meant to touch. She told herself it was nothing, an old architectural quirk. She was wrong, and somewhere beneath the marble and gold of that penthouse, a secret was already waiting to change everything she thought she understood about the man who had just asked if she was hurt, and the world he ruled from 62 stories above the city that never noticed people like her at all. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at her studio with no return address, containing a single line typed on heavy cream paper. You will report to the penthouse directly from now on. No assistance. No exceptions. AC. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse foyer now. A privilege, Sienna would later learn, that almost no one outside Adrian Cross's inner circle was given. She stepped out each morning into marble silence, past men who nodded without speaking, past Adrian's assistant, a sharp woman named Priya, who handled the household with the precision of a surgeon, and into the East Wing, where her fabric samples and floor plans had taken over an entire room. She hadn't seen Adrian since the party. She'd expected, given the note, that she would be summoned constantly, watched, questioned. Instead, there was only silence from him, and an unsettling sense that she was being observed from somewhere she couldn't see. It was on the 5th day that he finally appeared, unannounced, standing in the doorway of the room she'd converted into her design studio, watching her argue with a fabric swatch, as if it had personally offended her. You don't like the blue, he said. She turned, startled by how quietly he moved for a man his size. It photographs beautifully. It just doesn't feel like this room. Morning light, not evening light. This blue will look muddy by 10 a.m. Then change it. I would, if the client hadn't already approved it, twice. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. The client was wrong. The client, she said, is you. I'm aware. He crossed the room slowly, studying the mood boards, the hand-drawn elevations she still preferred over digital renderings. He stopped in front of a sketch of the library, adjacent to the hallway with the strange seam in the wall. You spend a lot of time on this room. It's the heart of the space. Everything else orbits it. She hesitated, then decided boldness had served her better than caution so far. There's a gap in the paneling in the hallway outside it. Not on any blueprint I've been given. I assume it's original to the building, but I'd like access to confirm before I finalize the lighting plan. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room did, the way pressure shifts before a storm breaks somewhere out of sight. That hallway isn't part of your renovation, he said. It connects directly to a room that is. It's not part of your renovation, he repeated, quieter this time, and the quiet was worse than if he'd shouted. Is that understood, Miss Marlowe? She held his gaze longer than she probably should have. Longer than any of his employees seemed willing to. Understood. I'll work around it. He studied her for a moment that stretched too long to be comfortable, as if recalibrating something in his understanding of her. Then he turned and left without another word, and she stood alone in the studio, heart hammering for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. That evening, as she packed up her materials, Priya appeared in the doorway with an expression Sienna hadn't seen on her before. Uncertainty. Ms. Hale is downstairs, Priya said. She's asked to see the design plans. She's not my client. She's asking for Mr. Cross. He's not available. She's insisting on seeing the plans instead, and given who she is, I'm not sure refusing her is wise. Sienna understood immediately what Priya wasn't saying. Vivian Hale was not simply a woman who had once been engaged to Adrian Cross. She was someone whose displeasure had consequences that traveled far beyond a single evening. Vivian arrived like weather, all motion and cold perfume, eyes sweeping the mood boards with practiced disdain. "So this is what he's spending money on now," she said, lifting a swatch and letting it drop. "Interesting choice of designer. Ms. Hale, if you have concerns about the direction of the renovation, I'm happy to walk you through the vision." "I don't need a vision. I need to know why Adrian hired someone so—" Vivian's gaze traveled over her, slow and deliberate, the same look Sienna had absorbed 100 times in rooms like this one. Practical, when everyone knows he only surrounds himself with things that reflect well on him. The words landed exactly where they were meant to, but Sienna had spent years building armor against exactly this kind of blade. "Then he must see something in my work that reflects well on him. I'd hate to disappoint either of you by guessing what." Something sharpened in Vivian's expression, surprise, maybe irritation at not getting the reaction she wanted. She set the swatch down with exaggerated care. "Careful, Miss Marlowe. This penthouse has had designers before you. None of them lasted. I don't intend to be like the others." Vivian smiled, and it did not reach her eyes. "No, I don't suppose you do." She left as suddenly as she'd arrived, heels echoing down the hallway, and Sienna stood alone, with her pulse thudding, certain she'd just made an enemy she didn't fully understand yet. What she didn't know was that Vivian hadn't come to inspect fabric swatches at all. She'd come to confirm whether Sienna's blueprints included the hidden passage behind the library wall, the one that connected, 3 floors down, to a room that hadn't officially existed in over a decade. And 2 floors below the penthouse, in a car parked along the curb with tinted windows and Chicago plates, a man Sienna had never met watched the building's entrance and made a phone call that would set the next 4 months of her life on a collision course she couldn't yet imagine. The request came through Priya on a Tuesday morning, phrased as a favor, but delivered with the weight of an order. Adrian wanted the library finished first, ahead of schedule, ahead of every other room in the East Wing. He wanted it done within 3 weeks. "That's not enough time to source the shelving alone," Sienna said, staring at the timeline Priya had handed her. "He knows. He said you'd find a way." She almost laughed at the audacity of it, except something in Priya's face told her this wasn't a request she could push back on the way she had with the paint color. She spent the next 4 days living inside blueprints and supplier calls, tracking down a custom millwork shop in Brooklyn, willing to rush an order that should have taken 6 weeks, negotiating with a lighting designer who owed her a favor from a project 2 years prior. By the end of the week, she had a plan that would work. Barely, if nothing went wrong. She brought it to Adrian herself, refusing to funnel it through Priya this time, wanting him to understand exactly what it had cost her to make his impossible timeline possible. He listened to her walk through the plan in his study, standing at the window with his back half turned, the city glittering behind him, like something indifferent to the two of them. When she finished, he didn't respond immediately. "Why does the timeline matter this much to you?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "It's a library, not a hospital wing." He turned, and for the first time since she'd met him, something in his expression looked almost unguarded, a crack in the granite. "There's an event happening here in 3 weeks. People I need to impress, and people I need to warn. The room needs to be finished before then." "Warn," she repeated. "You don't need the details. I'm rebuilding your library around a door I can't ask about, for a deadline tied to something you won't explain. Forgive me for wanting context, Mr. Cross." He almost smiled, that fraction of an expression she was starting to recognize as rare currency. "You're not like the designers I've worked with before. The others cared how the room would look in a magazine spread. You care whether it functions for the people living in it. That's rarer than you'd think, in my world. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't try. She gathered her plans and left before the moment could become something she'd have to examine too closely later, alone, in the quiet of her own apartment. She didn't know that 2 floors below, Vivian Hale was meeting privately with Dmitry Kovalenko, head of a rival family, circling Adrian's territory for the better part of a year. She didn't know the event Adrian meant was a summit to broker peace between the 2 families, one Vivian had personally suggested, and was quietly working to sabotage from the inside. What Sienna did know, 3 nights later, working alone in the library past midnight to meet the deadline, was that the hidden seam in the hallway wall had widened. Someone had been through it recently. There were faint scuff marks on the marble that hadn't been there the week before, and a smell, faint but distinct, of gun oil and cold air, as if the passage led somewhere with no heating at all. She should have left it alone. She told herself that even as she pressed her palm flat against the paneling and felt it shift under pressure again, more than it should for a solid wall, a narrow gap opened, barely wide enough to see through, revealing not a room, but a staircase, spiraling downward into darkness. "Ms. Marlowe." She spun around, heart slamming, to find Adrian standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the low light. "I told you this hallway wasn't part of your renovation," he said, walking toward her slowly. "I wasn't trying to." She stopped, because there was no honest way to finish that sentence. It opened on its own. "I touched it by accident." He reached past her and pushed the panel shut with a soft click, close enough that she caught the low, clean scent of him beneath the marble and dust of the old passage. "That door has existed longer than this penthouse has been mine. It was built by the man who owned this building before me, as an escape route. It leads to the parking structure 3 floors down. Why does it matter that I saw it?" His eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw something underneath the granite calm, something that looked almost like fear, quickly buried. Because very few people know it exists, and every one of them has a reason to want it kept that way. You just became one more person I have to trust, not to mention it to anyone. "I wouldn't." "I know," he said, quiet and certain in a way that surprised her. "That's what concerns me." He didn't explain what he meant, and she didn't ask, though the words sat with her long after he'd walked away, turning over in her mind like a stone she couldn't stop touching. She didn't yet understand that trusting someone, for Adrian Cross, was not a comfort. It was a vulnerability he had sworn, after everything Vivian had cost him, never to allow himself again. She also didn't know that Vivian had seen them together through the crack in the study door before Adrian ever noticed her in the hallway, and that what Vivian saw in his face in that unguarded moment terrified her far more than any threat Dmitry Kovalenko had made in their meeting that afternoon. The library was finished, 2 days ahead of the deadline, and Sienna stood in the doorway that morning, with a strange tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with pride, though she was proud of it. Floor-to-ceiling shelves in dark walnut framed the room, brass fixtures throwing warm light across reading chairs, upholstered in a green so deep it looked almost black. She had built the room around the person who would live in it, and realized she'd been building it around someone she was starting to understand, far better than a client should be understood. Adrian walked the room slowly, hands in his pockets, saying nothing, for so long she began to brace for criticism. "It's exactly right," he said finally, and the simplicity of it undid her more than any elaborate praise could have. "You sound surprised." "I am." He ran a hand along the edge of one of the shelves, and for a moment, his guard dropped so completely, she almost didn't recognize him. "My brother used to sit in a room like this, before." She went still, sensing the weight behind the word, the way it hung in the air like something he hadn't meant to say. Before what? He didn't answer right away, and she thought he might close the conversation, the way he closed every door that led somewhere private. Instead, he sat in one of the reading chairs, elbows braced on his knees, staring at nothing. Before he was killed, 6 years ago, someone he trusted sold information about his location to people who wanted him dead, and by the time I understood what had happened, it was too late to matter. Adrian, his name came out of her, softer than she intended, an instinct rather than a decision. "I don't tell people this," he said, glancing up at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she suspected very few had ever seen. "I'm not sure why I'm telling you. Maybe because I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are." Something shifted in his face, and for a moment, the distance between them felt dangerously thin. She thought, absurdly, that if she took one step closer, he might not step back. But before either of them could test that theory, his phone buzzed against the side table, and whatever had opened between them closed again, quickly, deliberately, like a door he'd remembered was supposed to stay locked. "I need to take this," he said, standing. She nodded, gathering her things, telling herself the moment had been nothing, a client's grief spilling over in an unguarded hour, nothing more. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "Sienna." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She turned, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't name, something between apology and warning. "Thank you," he said, "for the room." "You're welcome," she managed, and left before her face could betray how much those 2 words had cost her composure. She didn't see him again for 4 days. When she finally did, it was at a dinner Priya informed her that morning she was required to attend, a small gathering meant to celebrate the library's completion before the larger summit the following week. Sienna had not expected to see Vivian there, seated at Adrian's right hand as though she belonged there, laughing at something one of the investors said, with the practiced ease of a woman playing hostess in a house she no longer owned. "Sienna," Vivian said, when their eyes met across the table, her smile sharp as a blade, dressed up as courtesy. "I hear the library turned out beautifully. Adrian showed me photos. He seemed quite taken with it. And with you, I gather." The table went subtly quiet, the kind of quiet that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. "I'm glad he's happy with the design," Sienna said evenly. "Oh, I don't think it's just the design he's happy with." Vivian's gaze flicked toward Adrian, who had gone very still at the head of the table. "Tell me, does he still bring people to the library to talk about his brother? He used to do that with me too, back when he thought I was someone he could trust with things like that." The words were precise, surgical, designed to do exactly what they did, plant a seed of doubt in Sienna's chest that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the particular cruelty of being reminded she was not the first person to be shown a man's grief, and might not be anything more than the latest. "Vivienne," Adrian's voice cut across the table, low and final. "That's enough. I'm only making conversation, darling." Vivienne's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes did, something colder and more calculating than jealousy alone could explain. "Ms. Marlowe should know what she's getting into, don't you think? I certainly wish someone had warned me." Sienna excused herself before dessert, citing an early meeting, and Adrian didn't stop her, though she felt his eyes on her the entire walk to the elevator. She told herself it didn't matter what Vivian had said, that the moment in the library had been real, regardless of who'd come before her. But the doubt had taken root, quiet and persistent, and it would be 3 more days before she learned Vivian's comment hadn't been jealousy at all, but the opening move of something far more dangerous, a seed planted to isolate her from Adrian's trust, before the plan Vivian had built for months could finally reach its conclusion. The accusation came 3 days later, and it came fast, the way things fall when there's nothing left holding them up. Sienna arrived at the penthouse Monday morning to find two of Adrian's security men waiting by the elevator instead of Priya, their expressions carved from the same cold stone as the marble floors. They didn't greet her. One of them simply said, "Mr. Cross needs to see you. Now." She found Adrian in his study, standing behind his desk, instead of at the window, which she'd already learned to read as a bad sign. Vivian stood near the bookshelves with her arms crossed, wearing an expression of practiced sorrow that didn't reach her eyes. On the desk between them sat a laptop, open, displaying an email thread Sienna had never seen in her life. "Explain this," Adrian said, turning the screen toward her. She stepped closer and read, and her stomach dropped. The emails, dated over the past 2 weeks, appeared to be exchanges between her account and an unfamiliar address, discussing floor plans of the East Wing, the layout of the library, the location of the hidden passage, all addressed to someone signing off as DK. "I never sent these," she said, the words coming out steadier than she felt. "I don't know who DK is. I've never seen this thread before in my life. They're from your email address," one of the security men said flatly. "Sent from your IP address at your studio. That's impossible." "Is it?" Vivian's voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it worse. "You did seem awfully curious about that passage from the very first week you started here, Sienna." Adrian mentioned it himself. Sienna felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when the ground you thought was solid turns out to have been built on sand the entire time. "I asked one question about a gap in the paneling, because it affected the lighting plan. That's it. I don't know who Dmitry Kovalenko is, beyond the name I've heard whispered by your security staff, like he's the villain in a bedtime story." "You know his name," the second security man said, exchanging a look with his partner. "Because people have said it in front of me, not because I've corresponded with him." She turned to Adrian, searching his face for the man who had sat across from her in the library, and told her about his brother, the man who had said her name for the first time like it mattered. "Adrian, you know me." "I thought I did," he said, and the coldness in his voice was worse than anything he could have shouted. "But I've built an empire on the mistake of trusting the wrong person once already. Ms. Marlowe, I don't intend to make it twice." The use of her surname landed like a slap. She looked at him, at the granite wall that had replaced the man from the library, and understood, with a clarity that hurt more than the accusation itself, that he had already decided. Whatever doubt Vivian had planted at that dinner 3 nights ago had grown roots deep enough to choke out whatever had been growing between them. "I didn't send those emails," she said again, quieter now, because she refused to raise her voice or beg for something she shouldn't have to prove. "I don't know who forged them or why, but I have nothing to hide, and I won't stand here and cry to convince you of something that should be obvious if you actually knew who I am." "Security will escort you out," Adrian said, not looking at her. "Your access to the building is revoked, effective immediately. You'll be compensated for the work completed to date. The relationship ends here." She wanted to argue. Every instinct told her to fight, to demand a real investigation, to remind him of the library, of his brother, of the moment his guard had come down, and hers had followed it. But she had learned a long time ago that dignity mattered more than being believed by people who had already made up their minds, and she would not let this room, this man, or Vivian Hale's carefully engineered cruelty take that from her. "I hope you find whoever actually did this," she said, gathering her bag with hands that refused to shake, no matter how much the rest of her wanted to, "before it costs you something you can't get back." She walked out past the security men, past Priya, who stood frozen near the elevator, with an expression of quiet, helpless sympathy, and didn't look back once, not even when the elevator doors closed, and the tears she'd refused to shed in that study finally slipped free, in the privacy of the descending car. Vivienne watched her go from the study window, allowing herself a small, satisfied smile that vanished the instant she turned back to Adrian. He was still staring at the closed laptop, his jaw tight, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You did the right thing," Vivienne said gently. He didn't answer. He was staring at the email thread again, at a detail neither of the security men had flagged, a timestamp on one message that placed it 3 hours before a call he distinctly remembered Sienna making to a Brooklyn millwork supplier, a call he'd overheard because he'd been standing in the doorway of her studio at the time. The timeline didn't match, and somewhere in the quiet, controlled part of his mind that had built an empire out of noticing what other people missed, Adrian Cross felt the first cold thread of doubt about the woman he'd just thrown out of his home. Adrian didn't sleep that night. He sat in the library Sienna had built, in the chair she'd chosen for the morning light, and stared at the email thread until the timestamps burned themselves into the back of his eyes. 3 hours. That was the gap between the message allegedly sent from her account and the phone call he'd personally overheard her making, standing in her studio doorway with his own ears, discussing rush delivery fees with a supplier in Brooklyn. Either the timestamp was wrong, or the emails weren't hers at all. He called Priya at 6 in the morning and told her to pull the building's server logs, every login to the design database over the past 3 weeks, cross-referenced against Sienna's actual movements, according to the security footage he had access to, but rarely bothered to review. By 9, he had his answer, and it turned his stomach in a way few things had in years. The emails had been sent from Sienna's account, yes, but not from her IP address. They had been routed through a proxy, designed to mimic her studio's network, something only someone with real technical resources could arrange. And the timestamps, once corrected for the spoofed metadata, placed every single message during hours when the security footage showed Sienna nowhere near a computer at all, once during a supplier call, once during the final walkthrough of the library with him personally. Someone had built her guilt out of nothing and dropped it in his lap at exactly the moment it would do the most damage. He thought of Vivienne by the bookshelves, her practiced sorrow, the ease with which she'd produced the laptop as though waiting for the right moment. He thought of the dinner 3 nights before, the way she'd needled Sienna about the library, about his brother, planting doubt with surgical precision. He thought of how quickly she'd agreed with his decision, how relieved she'd looked. He should have seen it sooner. He'd built his life around noticing what others missed, and let 6 years of grief blind him to the person telling him the truth, because the lie was easier to accept than trusting someone again. His phone rang before he could act on any of it. Priya's voice was tight with urgency. "Sir, you need to see this. Ms. Marlowe's studio called security. There's been a break-in." He was in the car before she finished the sentence. The studio looked like a storm had passed through it. Filing cabinets overturned, hard drives missing, mood boards torn from the walls and scattered across the floor, like something had been searched for and not found. Sienna stood in the middle of the wreckage, pale but composed, a police officer taking her statement. She looked up when he walked in, and the expression on her face wasn't relief. It was wariness, the look of someone who had learned, painfully, not to trust what a person's presence might mean anymore. "Come to fire me from the job you already took away?" she asked, voice flat. "I know it wasn't you," he said, ignoring the officers, ignoring everyone else in the room. "The timestamps were spoofed. I have the server logs. I have you on my own security footage. During every window, those emails claim you were sending them." "That's convenient timing," she said, arms crossed. "You believe me now that my studio's been ransacked. I should have believed you before that." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so the officers couldn't hear. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm telling you someone did this to you deliberately, twice now, and I intend to find out who, and make them regret it. I already know who, Sienna said quietly, and something in her tone made him go still. Whoever broke in wasn't looking for my laptop or my files. They went straight for the drawer where I kept my hand sketches, the ones from the library, the ones showing the passage behind the wall. Adrian's blood went cold. Only a handful of people knew that passage existed, and fewer still had known Sienna had documented it, even in rough form, for her own lighting calculations. They didn't find them, Sienna added. I took the originals home 2 weeks ago. There's only a partial set here, the early drafts, incomplete. That's not going to stop whoever did this from coming back, Adrian said, already reaching for his phone. You need protection, now. I don't need you to fix this by locking me in another gilded room. I'm not allowed to leave. I'm not offering you a room, he said, and something in his voice made her look at him properly for the first time since he'd walked in. I'm offering you the truth, which is that Vivian Hale forged those emails to destroy you, and if she's willing to break into your studio to find drawings of a passage she already knows exists, then whatever she's planning is bigger than either of us understood, and it's happening faster than I have time to be careful about how I ask for your help. Sienna stared at him for a long moment, the anger and hurt of the past 3 days warring visibly with the cold, clear logic of what he was telling her. Outside the shattered studio window, the city moved on, indifferent, unaware that somewhere above it, in a penthouse with a hidden staircase built for men to disappear through, a plan 6 years in the making was finally beginning to surface. Tell me everything, she said. All of it. Starting with why Vivian Hale wants that passage badly enough to frame me for finding it. They sat in the wreckage of her studio until the officers left, and then Adrian told her everything, the way he should have told her weeks ago, back when the library had felt like the beginning of something instead of the site of its unraveling. His brother Marco hadn't simply been killed by rivals. He'd been killed because Vivian, engaged to Adrian at the time, had been secretly feeding information to Dmitry Kovalenko's family for over a year, meeting locations, security schedules, in exchange for a stake in territory Kovalenko had promised once Adrian's organization collapsed. Marco's death had been collateral, a demonstration meant to destabilize Adrian before a takeover. Adrian had spent 6 years rebuilding what that death shattered, and Vivian had spent 6 years pretending remorse, while quietly working for the same family that orchestrated it. Why keep her close at all, then? Sienna asked. If you knew, or suspected. I didn't know, not until 3 months ago. Adrian's jaw tightened. I found a message on a burner phone she thought she'd destroyed. I didn't confront her. I let her believe she was still trusted, because the moment she knew I was onto her, whatever she was planning next would accelerate, and I needed time to find out what that was before I lost the advantage of her not knowing I'd found her out. And the passage? Leads 3 floors down to the parking structure, but it also connects to an old service tunnel beneath 3 buildings on this block, including the one that houses Kovalenko's holding company. My father used it decades ago to move product without surveillance. I sealed it years ago, or thought I had. If Vivian's reopening it now, it's because Kovalenko needs a way in that doesn't pass through my security. Sienna felt the pieces settling into place with a cold, sick clarity. The summit, the one you needed the library finished for, is meant to be a peace negotiation between my organization and 3 rival families, including Kovalenko's. If he can get armed men into this building through that tunnel during the summit, when my guard is focused on the front entrances and the people I've invited in good faith, he doesn't need a war. He just needs one night. And Vivian needs me discredited and gone, so I can't accidentally lead anyone back to the drawings that would prove the passage exists and where it goes. Yes. Adrian looked at her, something raw moving beneath the calculation in his eyes. I am sorry, Sienna. Not just for believing the emails, For every part of this that put you in danger without your consent, from the moment I hired you." She didn't answer right away, turning the pieces over, feeling something Vivian's cruelty at dinner suddenly recontextualize into something far colder than jealousy. She wasn't warning me off you at that dinner, because she still loved you. She was trying to make sure I stopped paying attention to the library before I noticed anything that mattered. "Probably both," Adrian said. "Vivienne rarely does anything for just one reason." Sienna stood, moving to the window, watching the street below, where a black sedan she didn't recognize had been parked for the better part of an hour. "The summit is in 4 days. 3 now. Then we need those original sketches, and we need to know exactly where that tunnel surfaces on Kovalenko's side. And we need it before Vivian realizes I still have documentation she thinks was destroyed in the break-in." "We," Adrian repeated, something shifting in his expression. "You said it yourself. Whatever she's planning is bigger than either of us alone." Sienna turned to face him, and for the first time since the accusation in his study, something steadier than anger settled into her voice. "I spent years being underestimated by people who thought a person who looks like me couldn't possibly be paying close enough attention to matter. I noticed that seam in the wall the first week, Adrian, when your own security team walked past it every day without a second glance. Don't waste that advantage now, because you're too proud to use it." He crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that the air between them felt charged with everything unsaid since the library. "I'm not too proud. I'm afraid of what happens to you if I let you anywhere near this." "I already know what happens to me if I don't." She held up the drawer key, still clipped to her lanyard, the one to the small storage unit across town, where the original sketches waited, untouched. "Vivian already tried to destroy my career and my safety once this week. I'd rather face the rest of this with my eyes open than wait quietly for whatever she decides to do next." Adrian studied her for a long moment, something unguarded and fierce moving behind his eyes, the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about weakness and strength. "Then we go together, starting with the storage unit." Outside, the black sedan parked across the street, pulled away from the curb the moment they stepped out onto the sidewalk, and neither of them noticed the man behind the wheel, lifting a phone to his ear, speaking 2 words in Russian before the car disappeared into traffic, words that would reach Vivian Hale within the hour and set the final phase of her plan into motion, 3 days ahead of schedule. The storage unit was untouched, exactly as Sienna had left it, but the walk back to Adrian's car felt different, charged with the awareness that they were no longer simply reconstructing a mystery. They were racing against a clock that had just quietly moved forward without their knowledge. They spent the next 2 days in the war room beneath the penthouse, a space Sienna hadn't known existed until Adrian led her through a door disguised as a supply closet off the kitchen, revealing a bank of monitors and a long table covered in blueprints, far more detailed than anything she'd worked from. His head of security, a broad, quiet man named Reyes, cross-referenced her sketches against old structural plans from the building's original construction, mapping the tunnel's full length beneath 3 city blocks. "It surfaces here," Reyes said, tapping a spot on the map, "in the sub-basement of the Kellerman building, which Kovalenko's holding company leased 8 months ago under a shell name. That's not a coincidence." "So Vivian's known the layout of this for months," Sienna said, "and she's just been waiting for a reason to reopen it without anyone noticing." "Or waiting for the summit," Adrian said grimly, "because that's the one night I'll have every rival family's most trusted men in this building at once, distracted, drinking, believing they're safe. It's the perfect night to walk armed men in through a door nobody's watching." They worked until the war room windows, small and reinforced, showed the sky darkening outside for the second time since they'd started. Sienna's eyes burned from studying blueprints. But there was something steadying about the work itself, about being trusted with information that mattered, about Adrian consulting her instincts on the building's layout, the way he might have consulted Reyes, without the shadow of doubt that had colored every interaction between them since the accusation. It was past midnight when Reyes left to check the tunnel's midpoint access himself, and the war room emptied into something quieter, just the two of them and the hum of monitors casting pale light across the table between them. "You should go home and rest," Adrian said, not quite looking at her. "We reconvene in 6 hours. You should take your own advice." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I don't sleep well before things like this." "Neither do I, apparently, given I'm still here at midnight instead of in my own bed." She rubbed her eyes, leaning back from the table. "Can I ask you something?" "You generally do, regardless of whether I'm ready for it. Why did you actually believe the emails? Not the logistics of it, the how. I mean, why did some part of you decide it was easier to believe I'd betrayed you than to believe someone had set me up?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Because the last time I let myself trust someone, the way I was starting to trust you," he said finally, "it cost my brother his life. Some part of me has been waiting for 6 years to be right about never trusting anyone again, because being wrong about that would mean admitting I could have protected him if I'd just been more careful with who I let close. It was easier to believe you'd betrayed me than to believe I'd finally let someone in and gotten it right." The honesty of it landed somewhere soft and unguarded in her chest, and she understood, in that moment, that this was the first time he had told her something, not out of necessity, but simply because it was true, and because he'd decided she deserved to hear it. "I'm not her," Sienna said quietly. "Whatever Vivian broke in you, I'm not the reason it happened, and I refuse to spend whatever time we have left proving I'm safe to trust. Either you decide to, or you don't, but I won't beg for it." "I know." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that the air between them felt taut as a wire. "I already have. Decided, I mean. Somewhere between the library and the storage unit. I stopped being able to imagine finishing this without you standing next to me." The confession hung between them, fragile and enormous, and Sienna felt something in her chest crack open in a way she hadn't allowed since the study, since the word Ms. Marlowe had cut through her like a blade. Before either of them could close the distance the moment demanded, Reyes burst through the war room door, breathless, his face pale in the monitor light. "They've moved the summit up," he said. "Tonight. Vivian just confirmed it with the other families," said Kovalenko insisted. Said Mr. Cross approved the change personally. "I approved nothing," Adrian said, already standing, his voice gone cold and sharp as winter. "I know," Reyes said grimly, "which means whatever's coming through that tunnel isn't coming in 3 days anymore. It's coming in 3 hours. 3 hours became 2 by the time Adrian's men had secured every visible entrance to the penthouse, and Sienna stood in the war room watching monitors flicker with live feeds from hallways she'd walked a dozen times while designing them, now crawling with armed men moving like they'd rehearsed this before. "You're not going near that tunnel," Adrian said, checking the weapon at his hip with the calm efficiency of a man who'd done this before. "I'm the only person besides you and Reyes who's actually studied that tunnel's full layout," Sienna said. "You need eyes on the Kellerman side that know what they're looking at, and Reyes needs to be with you upstairs when the summit guests arrive, expecting a peaceful negotiation." "Sienna." "I'm not asking permission, Adrian. I'm telling you what makes sense." She held his gaze, steady, the same steadiness that had carried her through every room in this city, that had ever looked at her and decided she didn't belong. I've spent my whole life being underestimated by people who never bothered to look closely. Let that work for us tonight, instead of against me." He didn't argue again, though the concession clearly cost him more than words could carry. He pressed a comm unit into her hand and set 2 trusted men beside her, and 30 minutes later, she crouched in the Kellerman building's sub-basement, watching a service door swing open, exactly as Reyes's intelligence predicted. She counted the men as they filed through. 6, then 8, armed and moving with rehearsed silence, and relayed the number through the comm, in a whisper that felt too loud in the concrete stillness. Upstairs, the summit had begun, string quartet playing softly, while 3 rival families exchanged pleasantries over champagne, unaware the peace they'd gathered to negotiate was never the plan at all. It was Vivienne who gave herself away, not through any mistake in her carefully built lie, but through the one thing she couldn't control, a flicker of triumph crossing her face when Reyes's radio crackled with confirmation that armed men had breached the tunnel on schedule. Adrian caught it, standing 3 feet from her in a room full of people who still believed she was simply his gracious former fiancé helping host the evening. "You look pleased, Vivienne," he said, voice pitched low enough for only her to hear, though every instinct in the room seemed to sharpen at the change in his tone, "considering you're about to lose everything you spent 6 years building." Her composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The tunnel's compromised," Adrian said, louder now, letting the words carry to Kovalenko's men near the bar, watching their expressions shift from confusion to alarm. 8 of Dimitri's men are being met by 12 of mine in the Kellerman sub-basement. I imagine that conversation isn't going the way you promised. The room erupted into motion, guests scattering, Kovalenko's lieutenant reaching for a weapon before Reyes's men disarmed him. Vivienne moved toward the private hallway, an escape route clearly mapped in advance, and found Adrian blocking her path, his expression colder than Sienna had ever seen it, colder even than the day he'd thrown her out of his home. "Marco trusted you," he said. "I trusted you. And you sold both of us to the same family, twice, 6 years apart, because loyalty never meant anything to you, beyond what it could buy." Vivienne's hand moved toward the clutch at her hip, fast, practiced, and one of Reyes's men closed the distance before her fingers found whatever she'd hidden there, wrenching her arm back until she gasped. Whatever composed mask she'd worn for years cracked wide open, leaving only fury underneath. "You have no idea what it costs to be the outsider. Everyone underestimates," she said, breathless, fighting the grip on her arm. "I know someone who understands that better than you ever will," Adrian said, and she never once considered selling anyone out to survive it. Downstairs, Sienna watched through a rigged security monitor as Adrian's men secured Kovalenko's lieutenant, 2 of Vivienne's own guards surrendering without resistance, the loyalty she'd cultivated for years, dissolving the instant her plan collapsed. By the time Sienna made it back upstairs, Vivienne was already being led away in restraints, her carefully constructed world reduced to nothing in under an hour. The great room emptied of panic and filled with a different energy. Families who'd come expecting negotiation, now watching Adrian Cross dismantle a conspiracy in real time. Adrian crossed the room the moment he saw Sienna, ignoring the eyes still watching him, and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "You were right," he said, quiet enough that it belonged only to the 2 of them. "About all of it." "I usually am," she said, and something in her voice wavered, despite the steadiness she'd held onto all night, when people finally bothered to listen. "I'm listening now," he said, and reached for her hand in front of every family, every guest, every person in that room who had once looked at her like she didn't belong in it, "and I intend to keep listening, for as long as you'll let me." The string quartet had long since stopped playing, But the silence that followed felt, for the first time all evening, like the beginning of something instead of the end of it. The penthouse looked different in the weeks that followed, not because Sienna changed a single detail of the design she'd already finished, but because the light seemed to fall differently, through rooms that no longer held secrets she wasn't allowed to ask about. Vivienne's trial moved through the courts quietly, the way these things did in Adrian's world, resolved with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything else, and Dmitry Kovalenko's territory folded within a month, once his own family realized how badly he'd gambled and lost. Adrian didn't celebrate any of it. He simply returned, each evening, to the library Sienna had built, and waited for her there most nights, until her work at the studio was done. Her studio, rebuilt after the break-in with Adrian's quiet insistence on covering every cost the insurance wouldn't, had become the busiest it had ever been. Word had spread, not through any effort of Adrian's, but through the summit guests themselves, about the designer who'd helped uncover a conspiracy that could have ended 3 families in a single night. The same women who had once looked through her at that first party now called her studio directly, requesting consultations, dropping her name at dinners, like a discovery they were proud to have made first. She didn't need any of it to feel like she'd won something. She'd known her own worth, long before any of them decided to notice it. But she wouldn't pretend it didn't feel good, watching people who'd once called her too plain for a penthouse, now waiting weeks for a spot on her calendar. Adrian found her one evening in the library, sketching idly in the chair by the window, the same chair he'd sat in the day he told her about Marco for the first time. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching her, the way he had that very first week, though the quality of his attention had changed entirely, no longer measuring her against a standard, simply wanting to look. "I have something for you," he said, finally, crossing the room. "If it's another impossible 3-week deadline, I'm going to need better compensation this time." "It's not a deadline." He knelt in front of her chair, and she felt her breath catch at the sight of him there, at the small velvet box he held out, plain and unadorned in a way that felt entirely deliberate, entirely him. "I've spent 6 years believing that letting someone matter to me was the same as handing them a weapon to use against everything I've built. You taught me that isn't true. You taught me the people worth trusting are the ones who tell you the truth, even when it costs them something, who don't disappear the first time the world gets dangerous, who see exactly what they're walking into and choose to stay anyway." "Adrian, I'm not asking you to be anyone other than who you already are," he said, echoing words she'd once said to him in a room full of strangers who hadn't yet learned to see her clearly. "I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life making sure no one in this city ever makes the mistake of underestimating you again, starting with me, every single day, for as long as you'll have me." She opened the box with hands that weren't entirely steady, and found a ring simple enough that she knew, instantly, he'd chosen it thinking of her, rather than what a room full of people would expect to see on her hand. "Yes," she said, before he'd even finished the question properly, laughing despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, obviously yes." The wedding, 6 months later, filled the great room where the summit had once nearly ended in bloodshed, transformed now into something warm and golden. Every rival family, who'd once watched Vivienne's plan unravel, now raising glasses to the couple who'd unraveled it. Sienna wore green, deep and unapologetic, the same shade she'd chosen for the library chairs, because some things deserved to stay exactly as bold as they'd always been meant to be. Priya cried through the entire ceremony. Reyes, stone-faced through 6 years of quiet crisis, smiled so widely during the vows that half the guests teased him about it for weeks afterward. And when Adrian pulled Sienna close at the end of the night, in the library that had started everything, he pressed his forehead to hers and said the only thing that mattered. "You didn't make me weaker," he murmured. The words meant only for her. The granite in his voice finally, permanently softened into something steadier and truer than power had ever managed to give him. You made me the only version of myself, strong enough to actually deserve you. Outside, the city glittered on, unaware and indifferent as it had always been, 62 stories below a penthouse, where a woman once called too plain to belong, had finally, fully, unmistakably